On July 6, 1964, somewhere in the jungle near the Laotian border in South Vietnam, a 30-year-old army captain named Roger Donlon was walking the perimeter of a camp called Nam Dong. It was 2:30 in the morning. He'd been on guard duty, making his rounds, checking the defensive positions, looking for anything out of place. Everything seemed quiet. Maybe too quiet. He was getting ready to go off duty. Head into the mess hall. Check the guard roster. Wake up the next guy who'd take his shift. Just another night in Vietnam. Except it wasn't going to be just another night. Donlon had a feeling. The kind of feeling you get when something's wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on what. His team had been sensing it for days. The local villagers were nervous. Scared. They wouldn't talk to the American medics who normally were welcomed everywhere. 2 village chiefs who'd been friendly to the Americans had been found murdered. The Montagnard strikers and the Nung mercenaries who were supposed to be working together had gotten into a fistfight the day before, over a prostitute supposedly, but maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was tension, maybe it was fear, maybe some of them knew something was coming. Donlon had told his team sergeant earlier that day, "Get everyone buttoned up tight tonight. The VC are coming. I can feel it." One of his men, Staff Sergeant Merwin Woods, had written to his wife before turning in that night. All hell is going to break loose here before the night is over. He was right. As Captain Donlon stepped through the screen door into the mess hall to check the roster, the building erupted. A white phosphorus mortar round crashed through the thatched roof. The explosion threw Donlon backward, out the door he'd just entered. Another round hit the command post, setting it on fire. The night lit up with muzzle flashes and tracers. Mortars were falling everywhere. Machine gun fire was coming from all directions. Nam Dong was under attack, and this wasn't a probe. This wasn't harassment. This was a full-scale assault by somewhere between 500 to 900 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army soldiers. They'd surrounded the camp. They had the high ground. They had mortars, machine guns, grenades, demolition charges. They had intelligence from sympathizers inside the camp who told them exactly where every building was located. Their first mortar rounds landed with devastating accuracy on the most important structures: the mess hall, the command post, the communications building, the ammunition storage. Defending against them were 381 men, 311 Montagnard strikers, indigenous tribesmen who'd been recruited to fight the communists, 50 Nung mercenaries, ethnic Chinese who served as bodyguards for the special forces, 7 South Vietnamese special forces soldiers, 1 Australian advisor, Warrant Officer Kevin Conway, and 12 American Green Berets, Special Forces Operational Detachment, A726, 7th Special Forces Group. 12 Americans, against a force that outnumbered them at least 60 or 70 to 1. The Americans had been in Vietnam for only about a month. They'd been sent to Nam Dong to train the local irregulars, to build up the camp's defenses, to be a thorn in the side of the communists who used the trails from Laos to infiltrate men and supplies into South Vietnam. Nam Dong sat in a valley about 15 miles from the Laotian border and 30 miles west of Da Nang. It was in the middle of enemy territory. Everyone knew it was vulnerable. In fact, the decision had already been made to close the camp and relocate it to somewhere more defensible. The enemy probably knew that too. They probably figured now was the time to strike, before the Americans could pull out, before the camp could be reinforced, hit them hard, overrun them, kill the Americans, make a statement, show that the Green Berets weren't invincible. Captain Donlon didn't have time to think about any of that. He had to act. Now. The camp was on fire. Buildings were burning. The communications building had been hit, but the radio operator had managed to get out one message before the equipment was destroyed. Nam Dong is under heavy mortar attack. Request immediate support. Then the radio went dead. Donlon and his team sergeant, Master Sergeant Gabriel Pop Alamo, began fighting the fires. They needed to save the ammunition before it cooked off. Donlon ordered his men to get the ammunition out of the blazing storage building. Rounds were already starting to explode from the heat. They went in anyway. Pop Alamo was 45 years old, one of the oldest men on the team, a veteran, experienced, steady, the kind of guy you wanted next to you when everything went to hell. He was helping move ammunition when a mortar round landed nearby. Shrapnel tore into him. He went down. He was the first American casualty that night. He wouldn't be the last. Donlon saw enemy soldiers trying to breach the main gate. He grabbed a weapon and ran toward them. Through mortar fire, through machine gun fire, through exploding grenades. He spotted 3 Viet Cong with demolition charges trying to blow the gate. He killed all 3. Just him. Close range. No hesitation. Took them out before they could breach the perimeter. But there were more. Always more. They were everywhere. He moved toward a 60mm mortar position. He needed to get that gun back in action. As he got within 5 yards of the gun pit, something hit him. Felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. Hard. He looked down. Blood. Lots of blood. He'd been hit. Severe stomach wound. Shrapnel or a bullet. He couldn't tell. He stuffed a handkerchief into the wound, cinched his belt tight, kept moving. When he reached the mortar pit, he found that most of the gun crew had been wounded too. He directed them to withdraw to a safer position 30 meters away. He stayed behind, covered their withdrawal, kept firing at the enemy trying to push into the compound. Then he saw Pop Alamo. His team sergeant was down in the gun pit, wounded, unable to move. Donlon crawled toward him, dragged him out of the pit. While he was pulling Pop to safety, another mortar round exploded. Shrapnel tore into Donlon's left shoulder. Second wound. He kept dragging Pop. Got him to relative safety. Then, despite his stomach wound and his shoulder wound, despite the fact that he was bleeding and in pain and probably should have been seeking medical attention himself, Donlon grabbed the abandoned 60mm mortar. The weapon weighed maybe 45 pounds. He carried it, to a new position 30 meters away. When he got there, he found 3 more wounded defenders. He set up the mortar, started firing it, gave covering fire to other positions that were being overrun. But the mortar fire was coming from everywhere. The VC had the camp zeroed in. They'd probably spent days or weeks preparing for this attack, plotting their fire, registering their mortars. They knew exactly where to aim. Donlon realized the enemy was concentrating on the east sector of the camp. That's where they were trying to break through. If they succeeded, the camp would be split. The defense would collapse. They'd be overrun. He crawled. With a stomach wound and a shoulder wound, 175 meters to an 81mm mortar position. Bigger gun. More firepower. He directed the crew, got them firing on the enemy positions threatening the east sector. His fire kept the VC from breaking through. For now. But he couldn't stay there. He was needed elsewhere. So despite his wounds, despite the blood loss, despite the fact that any rational person would have sought cover and medical treatment, Donlon moved to an eastern 60mm mortar position. He assessed the situation. Decided that the enemy's assault had weakened slightly. Dawn was coming. Maybe they could hold. He crawled back to the gun pit where he'd set up the 60mm mortar earlier. Dragged it to the eastern position. Set it up again. Turned it over to 2 defenders who had minor wounds. They could operate it. He needed to check on other positions. So he left that sheltered position and began moving around the perimeter. Just moving from position to position, exposed to fire, hurling grenades at enemy troops, rallying his men, inspiring them, leading by example, showing them that if he could keep fighting with multiple wounds, they could too. The men who were there would later say his leadership made all the difference, that his courage was contagious, that seeing him keep going, keep fighting despite his wounds, gave everyone else the will to resist, to hold on, to not give up even though they were outnumbered and surrounded and taking heavy casualties. As Donlon moved around the perimeter, another mortar shell exploded nearby. Shrapnel hit him in the face and body. Third and fourth wounds. His face was torn up. Blood was running down into his eyes. He could barely see, but he kept going. And then the enemy tried something different. They brought up a loudspeaker. Through the darkness came a voice in English. "Americans, lay down your weapons. All we want are the Americans. Surrender now, and the Vietnamese will be spared." That put a chill on things. The message was clear. The VC weren't just trying to overrun the camp. They wanted to kill or capture the Green Berets specifically, make an example of them. Sergeant Thurman Brown was manning one of the mortar positions. He heard the loudspeaker. He dropped a mortar round right on it. The voice stopped mid-sentence. Donlon would later say he'd take that image to his grave. Brown shutting up that propaganda speaker with a single mortar round. But the situation was still critical. They'd been fighting for hours now. It was still dark. Help wasn't coming. The radio was out. They were running low on ammunition. Casualties were mounting. Sergeant John Houston went down. Killed. He was 24 years old. His wife was pregnant back home. He'd never meet his child. Pop Alamo, despite being treated by the medics, died from his wounds. 45 years old. His wife was also pregnant. Another child who'd grow up without knowing their father. Australian warrant officer Kevin Conway was killed. He'd become the first Australian soldier killed in action in the Vietnam War. Of the 12 Americans, 2 were dead. 9 of the remaining 10 were wounded. Only 3 men, specialists Vernon Beeson, Keith Daniels, and Thomas Gregg, escaped injury. The South Vietnamese and Nung defenders were taking even heavier casualties. The Montagnard strikers were being cut down. Some were fighting, some were fleeing, some were probably shooting at their own side because the VC had infiltrators among them. It was chaos, darkness, fire, smoke, explosions, screaming. The enemy was trying to get inside the wire, trying to capture the 81mm mortar that was keeping them at bay. Sergeant First Class Brown saw 6 VC trying to reach the gun. He charged them, killed them all, saved the weapon. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, 2 hours after the attack began, a flare ship finally arrived. An Air Force C-47 circling overhead, dropping parachute flares that lit up the battlefield. Suddenly, the VC weren't fighting in darkness anymore. They were exposed. The defenders could see them, could target them more effectively. The flares changed everything. The enemy's assaults slackened. Their fire decreased. They were still fighting, but the momentum had shifted. At dawn, Marine helicopters tried to land with reinforcements, but the fighting was too intense. They couldn't get in. They had to turn back. The defenders were still on their own, but daylight brought something else. Air support. Republic of Vietnam, Air Force A-1 Sky Raiders came in. Started hitting the enemy positions around the camp. Strafing, bombing, rockets. The VC began to pull back, started withdrawing into the jungle. The 5-hour battle was over. As the sun came up, Donlon could finally see the full extent of the carnage. Bodies everywhere, wounded men crying out for help, buildings destroyed. The camp was a wreck, but they'd held. Against overwhelming odds, they'd held. 58 South Vietnamese and Nung defenders were dead, 65 were wounded, more than 100 had deserted or defected during the battle. The 3 Americans, Alamo, Houston, and Conway, were dead. 9 of the 12 Green Berets were wounded, most seriously. The enemy had left 55 dead bodies around the camp, but they'd probably carried off many more. The actual number killed was likely much higher. Some estimates put enemy casualties at over 150. It had been a near thing. If the enemy had hit them an hour earlier, when half the team was out on patrol like they'd planned, the camp probably would have been overrun. If the flare ship hadn't arrived when it did, they might not have held until dawn. If Captain Donlon hadn't kept moving, kept fighting, kept inspiring his men despite being wounded multiple times, the defense might have collapsed. But none of that mattered now. They'd held, they'd won, barely, at terrible cost. But they'd won. Donlon finally allowed himself to be treated. He'd been going for 5 hours on adrenaline and willpower. Multiple wounds, blood loss. Probably should have been medically evacuated hours ago. But there'd been no time, no helicopters, no way out. So he'd just kept fighting. At 9:45 in the morning, 18 Marine UH-34 helicopters, escorted by 4 UH-1 Huey gunships and 2 Vietnamese A-1 Sky Raiders, began landing at Nam Dong. They brought in a 93-man relief force, started evacuating the wounded, resupplied the defenders with ammunition and equipment. By then, the battle was over. The VC had melted back into the jungle, gone, disappeared. Back to their bases in Laos, back to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They'd tried to overrun Nam Dong, tried to kill the Americans, tried to make a statement. They'd failed. Donlon was evacuated to a hospital in Saigon, spent over a month there recovering from his wounds. His team stayed in Vietnam, finished their 6-month tour, and in November they all flew home together. The 9 survivors and the bodies of their 2 dead teammates. Back in the United States, the battle at Nam Dong had made front-page news. It was one of the first major engagements of the Vietnam War that involved American forces. It was seen as a significant victory. Proof that the Green Berets could hold their own against superior numbers, that American advisors weren't just there for show, that they'd fight and win. Captain Roger Donlon was singled out for his role in the defense. The media loved the story. Small band of American heroes, surrounded, outnumbered, fighting against overwhelming odds. Their leader wounded multiple times but refusing to quit. It was the kind of story that sold newspapers, that made for good television. Donlon ended up on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, and then came word from Washington. Captain Donlon was being awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for military valor, given for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of one's life above and beyond the call of duty. It would be the first Medal of Honor awarded for action in the Vietnam War, the first ever given to a member of the United States Army Special Forces. On December 5, 1964, Captain Roger H.C. Donlon stood in the East Ballroom of the White House. With him were the 9 surviving members of Detachment A-726. Men he'd led, men he'd fought beside, men who'd held Nam Dong against impossible odds. President Lyndon B. Johnson placed the Medal of Honor around Donlon's neck. The medal itself is simple, a 5-pointed star suspended from a light blue ribbon. On the face is an image of Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom and war. On the back is engraved, Captain Roger H.C. Donlon, Company C, 7th SFG. In his remarks, President Johnson said, "Let any who suggest that we cannot honor our commitment in Vietnam find new strength and new resolution in the actions of this brave man and his comrades." This was December 1964. At that point, there were about 21,000 American troops in Vietnam. Most were advisors. The big build-up hadn't started yet. The war hadn't fully escalated into what it would become. A few hundred Americans had been killed. The wall in Washington with 58,220 names didn't exist yet, wouldn't exist for another 18 years. But the war was beginning, and Nam Dong was one of the opening battles. One of the first times Americans had fought in significant numbers against communist forces. One of the first tests of whether the United States could make a difference in Vietnam. After receiving the Medal of Honor, Donlon was asked if he wanted to say anything. He introduced President Johnson to each of the 9 survivors standing with him. Then he said, "The medal belongs to them too." He was right. Detachment A726 would become one of the most highly decorated units in Army history. In addition to Donlon's Medal of Honor, Master Sergeant Alamo and Sergeant Houston were posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. 4 team members received Silver Stars. 5 received Bronze Stars with V device for valor. 9 received Purple Hearts. For a 12-man team, that's extraordinary. That's everyone decorated. Everyone recognized for their actions that night. But here's the thing about the Medal of Honor, about medals in general. They're symbols, recognition, a way of saying you did something extraordinary. But they don't bring anyone back. They don't heal the wounds, physical or psychological. They don't explain why. They don't make it make sense. Donlon would carry that medal for the rest of his life. Not just physically, wearing it at ceremonies and events, but emotionally. The weight of it, the responsibility, the knowledge that 2 of his men died that night, that their wives were pregnant, that their children grew up without fathers, that his actions earned him recognition while Pop Alamo and John Houston came home in flag-draped coffins. He'd say years later, "I wear this award on behalf of those who didn't come home. I've had many great opportunities to share their sacrifices." That's the burden of the Medal of Honor. It's not just an award for what you did. It's a responsibility for the rest of your life, to honor those who didn't make it, to tell their stories, to make sure they're not forgotten. Roger Donlon would go on to have a distinguished military career. He returned to Vietnam for additional tours. He commanded the 3rd Battalion, 7th Special Forces Group in Panama. He continued serving his country for 30 years, retired as a colonel, lived in Kansas with his wife Norma. He wrote 2 books about his experiences, Outpost of Freedom and Beyond. Nam Dong. He donated his Medal of Honor to the 7th Special Forces Group so future generations of Green Berets could see it, learn from it, understand what it represents. He did reconciliation work with the Vietnamese, built a library and learning center at the site of the battle in Nam Dong, provided scholarships for Vietnamese students studying to be doctors, did the kind of work that builds bridges instead of walls, that heals instead of harms. He said his faith sustained him, that every day was a blessing, that he'd been given opportunities to make a difference and he was grateful for them. He died on January 25th, 2024, 5 days before his 90th birthday. He was buried at Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery with full military honors. A horse-drawn caisson, 21-gun salute, hundreds of mourners, including students from the Command and General Staff College, who lined the streets to honor him. The first Medal of Honor recipient of the Vietnam War, the first Special Forces soldier to receive the nation's highest award for valor, a man who fought for 5 hours while wounded multiple times, who refused to quit, who inspired his men to hold against overwhelming odds. But if you'd asked Roger Donlon what he was most proud of, he probably wouldn't have talked about the Medal of Honor. He'd probably have talked about his men, about Team A726, about how they all did their jobs that night, how they all fought together, how they all held the line. The medal was his, but the honor belonged to all of them. That's the real story of July 6, 1964. Not just one man's heroism, but 12 men doing the impossible, fighting against odds that should have been insurmountable, holding a position that should have been overrun, surviving a battle that should have killed them all. 2 didn't survive. Pop Alamo and John Houston gave their lives at Nam Dong. Their names are on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Panel 1E, line 11 and line 12, among the first names on the wall, among the first Americans killed in combat in Vietnam. Their children grew up hearing stories about their fathers, about what they did, about how they fought, about how they died defending a small camp in a jungle valley most Americans had never heard of and never would. By the end of the Vietnam War, 258 Medals of Honor would be awarded, more than half of them posthumously. 58,220 Americans would die in Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands more would be wounded. Millions would serve. But Roger Donlon was the first Medal of Honor, the first recognition that this war, whatever it was, whatever it would become, was producing acts of extraordinary courage, that Americans were fighting and dying in a place most couldn't find on a map. For reasons that weren't always clear, in a conflict that would tear the country apart. Nam Dong was just the beginning. The camp was eventually closed, as planned. The defenders were relocated to a new position closer to the border. The VC probably came back, probably used the area again, probably infiltrated more troops and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The war went on, escalated, got bigger, more brutal, more complicated, more divisive. But on July 6, 1964, at a small camp called Nam Dong, 12 American Green Berets and their Vietnamese and Chinese allies held the line, fought off an attack by a force that outnumbered them more than 60 to 1. Lost 2 of their own, but saved the rest. Did their jobs. Did their duty. And one of them, a 30-year-old captain from Saugerties, New York, who'd struggled to find his place in life until he joined the army, who'd fought for 5 hours while wounded 4 times, who'd refused to quit even when everything seemed lost, became the first man to receive the Medal of Honor in the Vietnam War. His name was Roger Hugh Charles Donlon. He lived to be almost 90 years old. He wore the Medal of Honor for nearly 60 years. He never forgot Pop Alamo and John Huston, never forgot the night everything went to hell at Nam Dong, never forgot what it cost to hold that camp. He'd tell people who asked about the medal, "This belongs to them too." The medal sits in a display case now at the 7th Special Forces Group headquarters. A reminder, a symbol, a piece of history from a war that's been over for 50 years, but whose lessons and costs are still being understood. On the back, engraved in the metal, Captain Roger H.C. Donlon. On the front, Minerva, goddess of wisdom and war. And if you could ask Minerva what she saw that night at Nam Dong, what would she say? Maybe she'd talk about wisdom, the wisdom of fighting when outnumbered, of leading by example, of never giving up even when wounded and bleeding and facing impossible odds. Maybe she'd talk about war, the brutal reality of it, the cost of it, the way it tests people in ways nothing else can. Or maybe she'd just say, they did their duty, they held the line. 2 of them died, the rest survived, and their captain received a medal that he wore on their behalf for the rest of his life. That's the story. That's what happened on July 6, 1964, at a small Special Forces camp in the jungle near Laos. 12 Americans against hundreds. 5 hours of fighting, 2 killed, 9 wounded. 1 Medal of Honor. The first Medal of Honor of the Vietnam War. But not the last. Not by a long shot.